and welcome to Bad Book Club, where I, Jade, a silly goose with an English degree, read classic and popular literature so you don't have to. Hello friends, and welcome back to this episode of Bad Book Club. Today we're going to be talking about It, as you likely know if you follow us on our social media at Bad Book Club Pod. But if you don't know, It is an insanely long book. It's like over 1,000 pages, and I can't possibly cover it in just one episode. So I decided that in the lead up to Halloween, we will be doing a 3-part series of It. I will release this episode on Wednesday, and then on Friday we'll release part 2, and then on Halloween will be part 3. I am going to refrain from any analysis until part 3, episode 3, because I feel like it's Halloween, and I wanted to just kind of scare you and give you a scary story of It, and it's kind of like a quick audiobook maybe if you haven't seen it, or if you haven't read the book before, or maybe you have and it was a long time ago. I don't know. I just thought it would be very spooky and fun, and that would be very Halloween-y. So I'm very excited, and I think that we should just jump into it and get started on this Halloween week. Let's do it. First of all, before we get fully started, let me explain It to you just a little bit. Let me read the back cover so you get a feeling for what it is, all right? To the children, the town was their whole world. To the adults, knowing better, Derry, Maine was just their hometown. Familiar, well-ordered, a good place to live. It was the children who saw and felt what made Derry so horribly different. In the storm drains, in the sewers, it lurked, taking on the shape of every nightmare, each person's deepest dread. Sometimes it reached up, seizing, tearing, killing. The adults, knowing better, knew nothing. Time passed and the children grew up, moved away. The horror of It was deep buried, wrapped in forgetfulness, until the grown-up children were called back, once more to confront It as it stirred and coiled in the sullen depths of their memories, reaching up again to make their past nightmares a terrible present reality. So that is the story of It, and it explains why it's so long. It's over 1,000 pages. It's a ridiculous size. And the reason why is because it spans these kids' whole lives, kind of, and the maybe 30 years in this town of Derry. It switches between lots of perspectives. And I just thought I would let you know because there is so much happening in this book, and structurally, since it's so huge, it has interesting structures. It's cut into 5 parts, and in each one, there are chapters, and each chapter has labeled scenes. So chapter 1 starts with scene 1, and then there's scene 2, and it switches to a different scene. So I just wanted you to know, because if I jump around, if it seems random, I am just following the book, and I promise it will eventually find its way around to you. And in today's episode, we're only going to be talking about part 1 and part 2. So I am ready to start. If you guys are, I just wanted you to keep that in mind while we go along. So yes. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began so far as I know or can tell with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. That's the very first sentence. The very first bit is called, part 1, is called The Shadow Before, and it begins with this little boy named George Denbrough, who's 6 years old, and his brother William, and they go to Derry Elementary School, but after this was set in 1957, George is playing outside in the rain because there's just been a flood in Derry. It talks about how floods are really frequent in Derry because of the way the town is structured. And Bill, unfortunately, his brother, Bill, is sick with the flu and can't go outside. And George asks his brother to help him construct this little newspaper boat so that he can, watch it kind of flow through the streets of Derry. So his brother's like, fine, go get the wax from downstairs. And there's this spooky scene where George has to go downstairs into the garage and grab the wax. And it's dark down there and spooky. And then he goes back upstairs. His brother helps him wax the boat. And then he takes the boat outside and he starts running along with it, following his boat around in his little yellow raincoat, and it's still raining a bit, and he's just dashing through the streets. And while he's dashing through the streets, he's watching his boat running alongside it, and the boat kind of swings toward a gutter. And George says, he follows it. He's like, where's it going? And he sees in this gutter that there is a clown sitting there. And this clown is interesting. So he says, look, there was a clown in the storm drain, The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Denbrough was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, it looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle, who talked by honking his, or was it her, George was never really sure, horn on Howdy Doody. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white, and there were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors, like gorgeous ripe fruit, in one hand. In the other, he held George's newspaper boat. Now, unfortunately, the clown starts talking to George and says, "Would you like a balloon?" And George is like, "I don't know, I think so." And "You want one?" And he says, "I do, yeah, I do." And the clown says, come get it down here. And George leans forward, and George, describes that he can smell the smells of like a circus, and that he's like excited because it's a clown, and it's like, it's so sad. And this whole time, this clown is called Pennywise, and he's holding his little boat, and he reaches in, and the clown seizes his arm, and George sees the clown's face become terrible and awful and scary. "They float," he says. "They float, Georgie, and when you're down here with me, you'll float too." And then Georgie dies. He dies. That's the way he starts this book. So I'm not supposed to do analysis, but I can tell you my reactions at least. I was real shocked. But anyway, chapter 2 is entitled After the Festival, and it takes place in 1984. Adrian Mellon, a gay man, and his boyfriend Don Haggerty attend the Derry Canal Days Festival, where they attract the attention of some not very great people, someone named Steve Dubé, John Webby Garden, and Chris Unwin. Unfortunately, they attract their attentions, they rile them up, and after their day at the festival, the two boys go to a club known as the Falcon. When they come out of the Falcon, Webby, Steve, and Chris are all waiting for them by the bridge. Unfortunately for these poor two boys, they really focus in on Adrian Mellon, and they beat him up and they do terrible things, and his boyfriend Don is trying to get away and run for help, and no one is noticing as they get pummeled on this bridge. And the boys get a little bit overzealous, and they toss Adrian Mellon over the side of the bridge. Now, this chapter is mostly done by interrogations in police rooms, interrogating all of the characters. Now, this next bit has several different stories to it, but basically, a couple of them claim that they saw a silver clown drag Mellon underneath what they call the kissing bridge. Don Haggerty, his boyfriend, goes down to follow him to try and get him out. And when he's down there, he sees thousands of multicolored balloons underneath the bridge. And news of the murder and the report and the strange clown makes a couple of the police guys wary, because they're like, maybe there was a clown, like two of them saw a clown, but no one makes a move on it because they want to send these, like men who beat up these poor boys to jail. And that's chapter 2. Part 1 only has 3 chapters, although it's pretty long, and I'll tell you why. It's because the next chapter is entitled 6 Phone Calls. 6 people are going to receive phone calls, and we are going to track the story of all those people getting all of these phone calls. And so let's jump into it. The first bit starts with Patricia Uris telling us that on the night of May 28th, 1985, that she should have known something was wrong. And then she backtracks. She tells us how she met her husband, Stanley Uris, and how they both worked towards a very profitable financial life, and how despite their efforts, they could never have children. She describes how she sometimes noticed that he had trouble sleeping, how she sometimes noticed that he was kind of odd in a way. They'd be having a conversation and he'd say, "The turtle can't help us," which is an actual quote, and she would be confused and he wouldn't elaborate on it. She says that on this night, May 28th, that she and him were watching television when Stanley received a phone call. She was sewing while he received it, but this is basically what he said. "Who did you say?" Patty felt an instant of fright. Later, shame would cause her to lie and tell her parents that she had known something was wrong from the instant the telephone had rung. But in reality, there had only been that one instant, that one quick look up from her sewing. but maybe that was all right. Maybe they both suspected that something was coming long before that phone call, something that didn't fit with the nice house set tastefully back behind the low yew hedges, something so much a given that it really didn't need much of an acknowledgement. That one sharp instant of fright, like the stab of a quickly withdrawn ice pick, was enough. You? Well, I'll be damned. Mike, how did you... He fell silent again, listening. As his smile faded, she recognized, or thought she did, his analytic expression. Are you sure, Mike? Finally, after a very long pause, he said, All right, I understand. Yes, I have everything. I have the picture. What? No, I can't absolutely promise that, but I'll consider it carefully. You know that... Oh, he did? Well, you bet. Of course I do. Yes, sure. Thank you. Yes. Bye-bye. And he hung up. Stanley sits down next to his wife, and Patty doesn't seem to find anything amiss with him other than maybe a little bit of an odd expression. And he tells her that he needs to take a bath. And she says, sure. And in a little while, she realizes that's very odd because Stanley never takes baths at this time of day. So she starts to feel a little bit worried and foreboding, and she starts calling out his name because she realizes that she's not hearing the water run. So she goes upstairs and she realizes that the door has been closed, which is odd because they don't close the doors when they're taking baths. And she reluctantly opens the door, knowing something is terribly wrong, and this is what she sees. The water in the tub was bright pink. Stanley lay with his back propped against the rear of the tub. His head had rolled so far back on his neck that strands of his short black hair brushed the skin between his shoulder blades. If his staring eyes had still been capable of seeing, she would have looked upside down to him. His mouth hung open like a sprung door. His expression was one of abysmal, frozen terror. A package of razor blades lay on the rim of the tub. He had slit his inner forearms open from wrist to the crook of the elbow, and then had crossed the cuts just below the bracelets of fortune, making a pair of bloody capital T's. The gashes glared red-purple in the harsh white light. She thought the exposed tendons and ligaments looked like cuts of cheap beef. He had dipped his right forefinger in his own blood and had written a single word on the blue tiles above the tub, written it in 2 huge, staggering letters. A zigzagging, bloody finger mark fell away from the second letter of this word. His finger had made the mark, she saw, as his hand fell into the tub where it now floated. She thought Stanley must have made that mark, his final impression on the world as he lost consciousness. It seemed to cry out at her, it. In the next scene, a man named Richie Tozier tells us that after Mike called him that he couldn't stop vomiting, that now he has to go home. He tells us that he is a very successful radio star, I guess, and he uses voices to, do fun voices. So he does different characters. And he says that he doesn't remember anything from his childhood. Mike asked him how much he remembered, and he said not much. And he tells us that some of the memories came back to him. Memories of Bill saying that someone killed his brother. Memories of darkness under Derry where machines thundered on and on. He says he remembers George, and then he starts vomiting again. He can barely keep it together. He says that he needs to pack to go home, and he arranges a flight through his travel person, and he doesn't expect to make it back. In the next scene, Ben Hanscom arrives at his favorite Friday and Saturday night bar, the Red Wheel. He is the U.S.'s most promising up-and-coming architect, very famous and successful, and no matter where he's been the last couple years, Ricky Lee, the owner of the bar, has been able to expect Ben to come in every Friday and Saturday night. On this night of May 28th, 1985, he was surprised to see Ben, and even more surprised when Ben seemed particularly out of sorts. He seemed down and not talkative and haunted, and he thought someone had died. And then Ben asked for something ridiculous, and I will read to you. Bring me some of those lemon wedges there. Ricky Lee brought him 4 and laid them out neatly on a fresh napkin next to the stein of whiskey. Hanscom picked one up, tilted his head back like a man about to administer eye drops to himself, and then began to squeeze raw lemon juice into his right nostril. Holy Jesus, Ricky Lee cried, horrified. Hanscom's throat worked. His face flushed, and then Ricky Lee saw tears running down the flat planes of his face toward his ears. Now the spinners were on the juke, singing about the rubber band man. "Oh Lord, I just don't know how much of this I can stand," the spinners sang. Hanscom groped blindly on the bar, found another slice of lemon, and squeezed the juice into his other nostril. "You're gonna fucking kill yourself," Ricky Lee whispered. Hanscom tossed both of the wrung-out lemon wedges onto the bar. His eyes were fiery red, and he was breathing in hitching, wincing gasps. Clear lemon juice dripped from both of his nostrils and trickled down the corners of his mouth. He groped for the stein, raised it, and drank a third of it. Frozen, Ricky Lee watched his Adam's apple go up and down. Hanscom set the stein aside, shuddered twice, then nodded. He looked at Ricky Lee and smiled a little. His eyes were no longer red. "Works about like they said it did." Ben Hanscom then goes on to give Ricky Lee a silver, I believe, coin, and says that he has no need for it anymore. He also mentions that when he was a child, he remembers all of these terrible things that have happened to him. He remembers that he used to be overweight, and that he remembers a boy holding him down and cutting his initials into his stomach, and he shows Ricky Lee the scar. He then says that he's not sure if he'll be back, but that he hopes Ricky Lee does okay, and he leaves. And Ricky Lee is very concerned. In the next scene, Eddie Kasprak has to leave his wife so that he can fly home to Derry. He mentions that on the top shelf he's packing his Anacin, Excedrin PM, Contact, Gelusil, Tylenol, and a large blue jar of Vicks. There's also bottles of Vivarin and a bottle of Serotan. He grabs milk of magnesia, Tums, Digel tablets, and then on the second shelf, he grabs his vitamins, E, C with rose hips, B simple, B complex, and B12. His crying and weeping wife is overweight and reminds him of his own mother, who used to terrify him about his health and demand that he could never run, that everything would give him cancer, and in general, just scare him all the time. She's weeping because she doesn't understand why he's trying to leave, and he doesn't want to explain it to her. And he doesn't know how to explain it. He just knows he has to leave. And so he says that he hopes he'll be back, that she doesn't understand where he's going, but she's crying, and he leaves. In the next scene, Beverly Rogan leans over her husband Tom to answer the phone. He is a little out of sorts and still drunk from his night of partying with his friends, and goes to the fridge to grab something to drink. When he gets back, he sees that she's still on the phone, and she's saying, "I understand that, Mike. Yes, I am. I know. But Bill Denbrough," she exclaimed. And he is starting to get more and more annoyed, her husband, Tom. He notices that she starts to pack her things. He also notices that she is smoking a cigarette. He remembers the very first lesson that he ever taught her, he tells us. He says that on one of their first movies out, after a while they had been dating, she lit a cigarette and he hit her and told her that she wasn't allowed to do that anymore. And then he decides that on this night she's being disrespectful and he's going to have to reteach her a lesson. She tries to explain to him that was an old friend and that something terrible happened to her when she was younger and that she now has to go to her hometown, and he doesn't want to hear it. He tells her to put down whatever she's holding, that he's going to give her a whooping, he says. He grabs a belt, and she seems less scared than she usually is. He doesn't like the look in her eyes of fear, but not of him. He also mentions that she is the one who has gotten them all of their money through a clothing store. And anyway, he says that he's going to whoop her, and she says, "Please don't." And he says she tries to grab the whip from him, which is the very first time she ever did that, the whip being the belt. And he gets livid, and they have a big fight. She breaks for the bed and the vanity table and starts throwing things at him like she's never done before. She kicks him, she grabs the belt, she hits him with the belt, and she starts throwing more things around, knocking things around. She grabs her clothes and barefoot leaves the house with her husband Tom screaming in rage behind her. And she realizes that she's actually happy, and she starts to laugh outside of her house, holding her suitcase, knowing that she has to go home, but still happy. In the last scene of this chapter, Bill Denbrough tells his wife Audra, the famous movie star, that he has to leave and go home to Derry. He explains that he got called by an old friend and that he's scared because he seems to have forgotten his entire childhood. He tells her that he had a brother named Georgie who died that he completely forgot about. He tells her that he has scars on his palms that have just appeared, that he remembers from being a kid having these scars on his palms, but she has never seen them even though they've been married. We also learn that Bill is a famous author of horror novels and that he and his wife are both incredibly successful. She doesn't want him to go. She's scared for him, but she's willing to believe him that something terrible happened, that his memory wasn't what it was, and that these scars just miraculously appeared on his hands. She tells him that if he has to leave from the movie they're making of his book, then he should and fly home to Derry, and so he does. Each part ends with something called an interlude, which is taken from, it says, the writings of someone named Mike Hanlon. It is his unpublished set of notes and fragments and manuscript found in the Derry Public Library vault. And it was originally called Derry, A Look Through Hell's Back Door. He asks in this interlude, can an entire city be haunted? And then he defines haunting for us. Haunted, often visited by ghosts or spirits. Haunting, persistently recurring to the mind, difficult to forget. To haunt, to appear or recur often, especially as a ghost. But listen, a place often visited, resort, den, hangout. And one more. This one, like the last, is a definition of haunt as a noun, and it's the one that really scares me. A feeding place for animals. Like the animals that beat up Adrian Mellon and then threw him over the bridge. He goes on to tell us that he has been speaking to older residents of Derry about anything kind of upsetting or tragic that has happened during their lives in Derry, because he thinks that something is wrong, that something every 27 years or so has been feeding on them. He tells us that Derry is his hometown, but that something terrible and evil lurks here, and it's evident in the weird and evil things that sometimes happen to their residents. Part 2 is entitled June of 1958. Ben Hanscom is currently sitting on a plane on his way home to Derry and begins to daydream and remember things that happened to him when he was a kid. He tells us that June of 1958, they were getting out of his last day of class and that he was getting his rank card from the teacher. He was nervous because a dangerous kid in his class named Henry Bowers was angry with him for not sharing answers to a test earlier that year. He says that he's in love with Beverly Marsh and stares at her all day in her red hair. And he, after he gets his card and everyone is released, he goes down the stairs, narrowly avoids Henry Bowers and his cadre of angry friends. And he finds his way to a candy shop to buy some candy, and he sits under a tree for a little bit. And then he goes to the library. He describes how he loves the library. He writes a poem, a love letter to Beverly Marsh that he can send anonymously, and then he leaves. Unfortunately, Henry Bowers and his two friends, Victor Chris and Belch Huggins, are waiting for him on the steps. They follow him home, Ben completely unaware that they're following him until he's standing on a bridge, and then they begin to attack him. Victor and Belch grab his arms for Henry, and Henry takes out his knife angry because of Ben. He'll have to take summer school, and his father will beat him every day because he's supposed to be helping with the farm, and he says that he's going to carve his initials into Ben. Ben is terrified. Even the men holding Ben seem really wary because Henry is getting extremely violent, and he starts to carve the letter H into Ben's belly. Ben is screaming, it's going terribly, and so, standing over this bridge, he kicks back and kicks Henry back and falls over the bridge. He falls down into a place called the Barrens. I'm going to be completely honest, this bit in the book was a little confusing to read. but presumably there's a bridge over some sort of forested or creek area called the Barrens, and I'm unaware about the topography of it all, but I'm just going to continue and pretend like I do know. And basically, as soon as he falls, Henry Bowers falls after him and begins to chase him again. They get to the lake. I guess there's like a little creek there, and Henry Bowers is injured from his fall from the bridge, and Ben kicks him and knocks him down and again runs away. Now Henry is enraged even more. Victor Criss and Belch Huggins are on his tail once again, and he starts running through the trees. Eventually, he finds his way through towards a sort of creek area, and he hears little kid voices, and he doesn't want to lead them there, so he goes to a different tree, and he falls asleep underneath this tree, hidden in its roots. While he's asleep, he remembers something that happened to him in January of that year. He remembers how he had helped a teacher put textbooks back that day after school, and it was January and snowing, and on the walk home, he passed the canal, and there was a clown standing there holding balloons that seemed to go against the wind. He said that the clown wanted him to take a balloon, and that the clown got slowly closer to him, and that he was pulled in, but something stopped him, and the clown got too close, and he got scared, and he ran home. He wakes up and goes back towards the voices of the little kids he heard before, hoping that they might be there, and still trying to avoid Henry Bowers and Victor Criss and Belch. And he comes across two kids. One of them has a bloody nose, obviously from when Henry Bowers paid them a visit while searching for Ben. And the other is holding him there, extremely worried because the one with the bloody nose is having trouble breathing. And he says to Ben, "Can you help? I think he might be dying." Now, Bill didn't actually say this, but he stuttered it because he has a terrible stutter. They call him Stuttering Bill. Bill Denbrough, the brother to George Denbrough from Chapter 1. He tells us that he, this summer, came across a bike that he calls Silver. The bike is huge, way too big for him to be riding, but it goes extremely fast, and that he loves when he's on it. And the only time when he doesn't stutter is when he says, "Hey-o, Silver, away," when he's on the bike. He also tells us that currently he's very nervous because Eddie, the boy with the bloody nose, angered Henry Bowers when he asked them if they had seen Ben, and he got punched in the face for it. But Eddie has asthma, and he's extremely scared that Eddie is going to die right now because his aspirator is out of his asthma medication. So Bill asks Ben to stay with Eddie, and Bill speeds away on Silver. And he stops by the drugstore and asks the pharmacist for medicine for Ben, and he gives it to him. And he doesn't understand that this medicine is like not that expensive or any of a problem. And he takes the medicine back to where Ben and Eddie are, and he gives it to them. And then the boys have this nice moment where they all kind of become friends and make fun of Henry Bowers. And they talk about how they're building a dam in the Barrens just for fun. And Ben says that he could help them if they'd like. And on the walk home, Eddie is nervous because the blood on his shirt will make his mom crazy. But Ben recommends just spilling chocolate milk over it to cover the stain. And then they all walk home. Upon walking home, Bill tells us that his family has been really cold ever since Georgie dies, and how they really don't pay any attention to him. He tells a joke, and neither of his parents really react or say anything. And he decides to go into Georgie's room, which has remained the same since he's died. And while he's in there, he reaches over and sees like a photo album, and he opens it, and he opens to the last picture that Georgie put in the photo album, which is a picture of his school class picture. And while Bill's looking at the picture, George's eyes look at him, and the right eye winks at him, and then he hears the image tell him that Georgie will be in the closet to say hi to Bill tonight. And Bill throws the album across the room, and then blood starts leaking from the picture, and Bill runs away. The next chapter starts with news clippings about a missing boy named Eddie Corcoran, and it gives us updated news clippings over the year as they realize that he's been missing, and that his stepfather also declared his Edward Corcoran's younger brother dead recently as well. So they opened that as part of the investigation. And we're told through these news clippings that his stepfather did kill his younger brother, but that he swears he did not kill Edward Corcoran. And they somehow still, though, blame him for both and put him in jail. And later, whenever he leaves jail, he hangs himself because he says that Edward did die. And then we learn what happened to Edward, or Eddie. Eddie Corcoran died the night of June 19th, the day that they all got out of school, because he didn't want to go home because he had had bad grades and didn't want to get a beating from his dad about it, so he went to the park instead. And in the park, something came out of the gloom and started following him. And he says that it was like the creature from the Black Lagoon, except it was wearing a silver suit with like orange pom-poms on it. And it starts chasing him, and he ran headfirst into a tree and injured his head. And he still tried to keep running, but then he tripped over a bench, and then the monster killed him. The next scene is from the point of view of a boy named Mike Hamlin. That same night that Eddie died, he couldn't sleep, and he woke up the next morning and decided to go to the park just 'cause. And while he was there, he found a pocket knife with the initials EC engraved on it and decided finders keepers and kept it for himself. But it got spooky for him, and he left. He then tells us that spring and summer were his favorite time of year because on his dad's farm, they would get everything moving, and that it felt wonderful to do the harvest, and that he'd get in the car with his dad and they'd whoop and holler through the fields, and that he loved it, and that it comes alive. And he says that during this time, his dad would leave him a note every day about what chores to perform around the farm, and that 1 or 2 days a week there'd be no note, and the note would say no chores, or there'd be a note telling him something fun to do around town that they could talk about later. So one day, his father leaves him a note that says, go to the old ironworks area and see the smokestack and bring back something that we can talk about. And so he goes to this old area a couple miles away where there was an explosion a long time ago that killed a lot of children on Easter Day, which is really sad. But he goes, and while he's there, he sees this giant bird staring at him, and he starts to run away, and the bird starts to chase after him and starts to try to attack him. He hides in the smokestack that's still there, and the bird tries to get into the smokestack, and Mike starts to pelt rocks at it and eventually hits the bird in its eye. And he waits for longer in the smokestack for the bird to try and to get out, to leave. And eventually when he creeps out, then the bird is gone. And he runs to his bike, he takes a gear from the place, and he rides home. And his dad asks him what happened, and he says that he fell while he was riding his bike, and he shows him the gear wheel, and he says that old place was really creepy. And his dad says, well, I'm really sorry, let's not go there again. And then he says that day beside the canal when he found the pocket knife, he threw it into the water, but he had left because he started to hear footsteps. In the next chapter, Bill and Eddie and Ben decide to come back the next day so that they can rebuild the dam that Victor Criss and Henry Bowers and Belch Huggins destroyed that they were working on for fun. They come back and they decide to build it, and Ben is ingenious at this stuff, and they're all very impressed, and Richie Tozier also shows up with his friend Stanley Uris. And they all decided to help. They decided to hang out and help and build the dam. And after they're done building it for the day and they're sitting up on the hill, Bill tells his friends about what happened with the album. This makes Eddie remember his own scary sort of memory. Eddie remembers how on days where he has nothing to do, he'll sometimes bike to the train yards. One day while he was biking there, a hobo who normally hangs out at the train yards came out from underneath this house on Niebolt Street and chased him down the street on his bike, and that he thought the man was a leper, but Richie tells him that the man actually probably had syphilis. And then he remembers too, to himself, that he went back to that house and decided that he had to look under the porch for himself and see what was under there. And he crawls under the porch, and he's looking around, and there's a cellar window. And through this cellar window, he sees the mutilated face of this leper man, but now he's wearing a suit, a silver suit with those orange pom-poms, and introduces himself as Bob Gray, and chases Eddie out from under the porch, screaming for him. and making fun of the hobo and his experience from last time, and Eddie just barely gets away. Surprised by Bill's story, Eddie also shares his experience of what happened. After this, Ben tells them about the floating balloons and the clowns that he saw. Stanley says that he has a story, but he doesn't want to tell it, and then Richie implies that he hasn't experienced anything like that. And then an officer named Officer Nell interrupts them. The next chapter starts with Richie Tozier on his way to Derry driving. He stops for a minute because of some car trouble, and he kind of unbearably laughs in kind of a hysterical way and then gets back on the road. The officer tells the boys that they've been playing in something called gray water, which is part of the sewage system of Derry. He says it's the water that gets used, and it's also the water that people pee in, and it comes through this area. So they've basically been playing in terrible water all day, and by building this dam, it's been clogging up people's drains. And while he's impressed with the engineering, he wants to know who did it. All the boys step forward to protect each other, and he seems kind of impressed and likes the boys because they're so cute. And he tells them just not to do it again, makes them destroy the dam, and he leaves. Now, after all this, Bill and Richie decide to go to Bill's house, and they have the idea that they should go and look around George's old room together because Richie is still not convinced. They go in, and Bill finds the album, which is now stained with blood, and he opens it up, looking for the photo, but the photo is gone of the one of Georgie in his school, and instead the pages move by themselves to a different old photo of Derry from back in the day, and as they're watching, the photo begins to move, and he begins to see that they are in the photo, which is impossible because the photo's from 20 years ago, and Bill reaches into the photo, and Richie grabs his arm and pulls him out, and his fingers come out all scratched up with scars and cuts on his fingers. And the boys are thoroughly shaken. The next scene is of Richie asking Beverly to join him for the movies and asking Ben to join him for the movies because Richie did some chores for his father and he wants to go see one of the horror movies. And so they go and they have a good time and they watch the movies, but they're a little nervous because Henry Bowers is in the first row. And as they leave, they try to go out the side door, but Henry Bowers and his henchmen notice and they meet them there. And the three of them versus Ben, Beverly, and Richie kind of take them on and fight them off and run away. And Richie decides to show Beverly the Barrens. And so they go, and she really likes it. And during this time, Ben is having an amazing time because he's so happy that they're together. And it kind of cements their friendship. And then the next scene is back to Bill and Richie. And Bill tells Richie that he wants to go to that house that Eddie told them about on Neibolt Street and investigate the leper that Eddie thinks he saw. The two boys agree to go together on Bill's big bike, and Bill takes his father's gun, and they go together, and they crawl underneath the house, and they begin to get really nervous, Richie especially, because they see that the glass has been shattered from the cellar, so the glass is shattered outward like someone punched outward, like Eddie said, whenever the leper/clown tried to grab him. Bill decides that he will go down into that cellar. So he climbs down through the window, and Richie goes with him. And they climb down in there, and they're looking around, and there's this big stack of coal in the background, and it looks like no one has been in this house for a very long time. And then something comes out of the gloom. And to Richie, it looks like a big werewolf from the movie that they had just been watching earlier that week with Beverly. And so he and Bill try to climb out the other window by climbing over the coal. And there's snarling and scary sounds, and something grabs Bill's ankle and tries to yank him back in, but Richie pulls him back out, and they run to Bill's bike, and they start running away, and the wolf almost drags Richie off of the bike, but they get away. And when they look back, Richie sees a werewolf wearing a silver suit with big orange buttons, and Bill sees a clown. They see different things. And they go home, and they stop their little bike on their way home, and Bill, in desperation to bring Richie back to consciousness because he somehow got hit on the head, he hits him again on the head, and they cry and hug together. The next chapter starts with Beverly flying home on an airplane to Derry and her remembering how after she left Tom's house that she went to her friend Kay, who gave her money and clothing, and how she took a bus to a different airport, being worried that her husband Tom would find her, and then flew home. She then remembers how when she was young, she was standing over the drain in her family's bathroom and thought she heard voices. And she began hearing the voices of all the kids in Derry who had been killed recently. There was the voices of Matthew Clements and Veronica and Eddie and like all these other voices. And she thought they were saying help to her. And so she leaned over the drain and blood sprays up into the drain, out of the drain, splattering the walls. And Beverly runs into the living room where her father is, Al Marsh, and she shrieks because of the blood. And Al asks what happens. He goes into the bathroom, doesn't see the blood that Beverly sees, and Al tells her that he worries about her a lot, and then he punches her in the stomach. And when he demands that she explain herself, she decides to tell him instead that she saw a really big black spider. And he says, "Oh, well, if you had told me that, I never would have hit you. Girls are scared of spiders." And he bends over the drain, and she can see that he's touching the blood that she sees, but he doesn't seem to see anything. And he explains that he worries about her so much, and she feels all these mixed feelings of wanting him to be like sucked in by the drain, of loving him, and she reasons that he only hits her because he worries about her and needs to fix her. And then her father tucks her into bed that night, and her mom comes home, and she and her dad go to their room. And the next morning, Beverly and her mom wash the whole house, but she's still really trepidatious to go into the bathroom. And so that day she meets up with all of her friends and she tells them what happened, and they decide to help her clean it up. So they go to her house and they clean up the bathroom with her that they can all see the blood. And then they go to the laundromat to wash the rags so her parents won't know that they used them. And while they're there, Stanley Uris finally decides to tell them his own story of what happened to him. Stanley Uris is a very clean and organized boy, and he likes things to be just so. He also enjoys bird watching, so one day he decided to go to bird watching to Memorial Park in the hope that he might see a specific bird in the large bird bath that's in Memorial Park. He brings his binoculars and he sits down on a misty day and he's hanging out. What Stanley doesn't know is that Memorial Park is also right next to something called the Standpipe of Derry. The kids explained to him that the Standpipe was something that people used to visit during the day, and it had this big basin of water, but it had to be shut down from visits because often people, sometimes kids, one time a baby, as or so urban legends go, would fall into the basin and drown and die because there was no way out of it. Stanley decides to continue his story. He says that he was sitting there staring at his birds, comparing them to the pictures in the book that he brought with him, when he suddenly heard a really loud noise and realizes that the door to the standpipe is open for the first time in a really long time, and he doesn't know how it opened, but it is open. So he goes to investigate, and he goes inside, and he starts to hear like carnival music. And shadows are kind of in there. And so he starts to go up the stairs kind of, I want to say, transfixed by this music. And he starts to smell popcorn and he is intrigued. But like I said, he starts to see these weird shadows and figures and he starts to get afraid. And so he runs back down, but the water has closed. The door has closed and he can't get out. And water starts to spill down the stairs and come up his ankles. And instead of popcorn, he starts to smell decay. And when he asks if anyone is there, they tell him, "We're the dead ones." And then these shadows start to come out and they say that they're floating now and that Stanley too will soon float. And in a panic, he grabs for the bird book in his pocket and he starts yelling out the names of birds that he likes. And for some reason, this seems to stop whatever is happening. And then the door behind him opens and he runs home, realizing that he has seen dead bodies and that something terrible has happened. And after his story, They decide that they should talk to Bill about all this. Bill is not there, by the way. And they all agree that they should talk to Bill, who is the de facto leader of what they call their losers club. And Stanley finds the whole thing absurd and doesn't want anything to do with it. He says he's not interested in figuring it out. He's not interested in fixing it. And they say, well, if we can fix it, then kids will stop dying. And Stanley's just not interested. And he says that they offended him and offended his sense of order of the world. And Beverly asks if they can at least go talk to Bill, and Stan finally agrees. And that night, Beverly leaves the boys and goes home with her rags and looks down the drain again. She doesn't hear any voices, but curiosity gets the better of her, and she decides to grab this tape measure of her father's and slide it down the drain. She decides to slide it all the way down 18 feet, and then she begins to hear voices again, warning her that she's going to die if she stands against them, if she fights them. And while she's doing this, fresh blood starts to come over the porcelain again and down the drain. And so she takes up her tape measure, and there's blood all the way down it, and at the very end, some sort of black thing. And she wipes it clean, not that her father will notice because he can't see it. And then she incinerates the dirty rags in their incinerator, and then she cries. The second interlude of Mike Hanlon's journals begin on Valentine's Day, when he discusses that 2 more children have gone missing in Derry, and both of their circumstances make no sense. The police can't seem to connect the dots, they're grasping at straws, and he's wondering whether he should call his friends, but he decides to wait because it might just be fear talking to him. On a second entry, dated the 20th, he talks about how his father told him of this event or place called the Black Spot that happened in Derry. His father was stationed on the army base, and often the black soldiers would go with the white soldiers to an unofficial officers' lounge in Derry. Some citizens of Derry got upset about this, and so they made a rule saying that the Black Regiment wasn't allowed to go to that place. And for consolation, they gave the Black Regiment this shed in the area where Memorial Park and the Standpipe now stand. And they turned that shed into something they called the Black Spot, which was actually a very popular bar and nightclub. Mike's father tells him this on his deathbed. Mike tells us that when he was younger, his father didn't want to tell the full story, and his father seems to imply that there's an evil in Derry that he's known about for a long time, but he assumes that it's just the same everywhere for black people. And he says that back in the day that this terrible thing happened, he didn't want to tell Mike it because he was too young, but now Mike is 15, his father is about to die, and he tells him the full story. He says that the Black Spot started to be really raging and popular, and people would come from all around to this tiny little shed where they had a band play, and they would serve drinks and food. And one night they were all there together, and something called the White Legion of something, I'll remember soon, decided to burn down the Black Spot. Now, Mike's father, William, tells us that he doesn't think it was on purpose. Maybe someone's torch just dropped because he doesn't want to believe that someone would do this on purpose. But unfortunately, when the White Legion showed up, they had torches with them, and someone, quote unquote, dropped it and set a fire in the kitchen. Unfortunately, this tiny shed wasn't fire safe, and a fire started in the back, and people started screaming in panic, and they shoved towards the doors. But since people were shoving toward the door and the door opened in, no one could get out. This was when Will's friend grabbed him and pulled him toward the kitchen, and at first he doubted it, but he pulled him toward the kitchen because there's a window there. They broke open the window, and Mike's father and his 2 friends were able to get out, and they were able to help out some other people. And then Mike's father's friend hopped in the car of an angry sort of officer and stole it, and punched him in the nose to take it, and then rammed it into the shed so that one of the walls fell down. And people came streaming out, but some of them weren't able to make it out. And Mike's father describes that he was haunted by the images of people on fire dying inside this place called the Black Spot, and that had been like a stain on the city of Derry for a long time because it was a terrible event. And then reluctantly, he tells Mike that he saw something else that day. And Mike says, "What did you see?" And he says, "Well, I saw a bird, a really giant bird, pick up one of the White Legion members and take him away." And Mike was like, "Well, what was the bird look like? Like, what was it?" And his father describes that the bird was floating and there were balloons on it and that it was just carrying the man away. And that day, Mike Hanlon wakes up after falling asleep in the library from writing his entry and sees that there are footprints walking up to his desk, and there's a red balloon tied there with an image of his face on it, melting. He sees the balloon and he screams, and the balloon pops. And that is the end of our very first episode on our series of It. I hope that you enjoyed it. I know it's a bit spooky, and I didn't offer a lot of analysis, but I'm going to be saving it all until the end. I promise I have a lot. I just wanted you to experience some spooky, scary stories this week and just get in the mood of Halloween. So that was what the plan was. I also just have another favor to ask you. If you like the podcast, if you've enjoyed it, if you've listened to it so far, I would really appreciate it if you rate it and maybe leave a review on iTunes. It really helps me get out there and noticed, and I love reading all your reviews. They make me so happy. You can also support the podcast if you want to buy any merchandise or one of the books that I talk about on the podcast. You can buy it and read it if you'd like. There's all these things you can buy. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. And I just hope you guys enjoyed today. I really liked talking to you about it. It's very spooky, which is super fun, and it got me in a fun Halloween mood. And I hope that you guys have the best week, and I'll see you very soon on Friday for part 2 of this series on It, and then our last episode will be on Halloween. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you guys have a spooky week, and I'll see you next time, lovelies. Goodbye.